So on May 17th, 2020, the Globe and Mail published an article about the plight of wooden grain elevators in the prairies, a subject that is near and dear to us here at Heritage Saskatchewan, since our 2018 Val-Marie Elevator Living Heritage Project, which documented and celebrated the significance of a restored wooden grain elevator in that southern Saskatchewan community. In 2016, the National Trust listed wooden grain elevators as one of the most endangered places in Canada, and yet here in 2020, we continue to lose these prairie agricultural icons at a rapid pace. I'm Kristin Catherwood, the Director of Living Heritage for Heritage Saskatchewan, and today I've invited our friend Ali Piwowar to speak with us today. She was interviewed for that Globe and Mail article, and I'd like to have a quick chat with her about grain elevators in Saskatchewan. So Ali's the principal architect and founder of the Heritage and Design Company. She's worked in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, focusing on the intersection of design and heritage conservation. Originally from Saskatchewan, Ali moved to Ontario to attend architecture school, and for her Master of Architecture thesis, she researched the tangible and intangible cultural heritage of wooden crib grain elevators in Saskatchewan, looking at why they are important and how they could be adaptively reused as a means of conserving their heritage. So before I get into the interview with Ali, I just want to acknowledge that today I'm coming to you from Treaty 4 territory in southern Saskatchewan, and Ali's speaking with us from the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation in Ottawa. Also, most grain elevators in Saskatchewan are located on Treaty 2, Treaty 4, and Treaty 6 territory. So Ali, thank you so much for being with us today, and welcome. And my first question for you is, why do you think grain elevators have become such an enduring symbol for agricultural areas in Saskatchewan?
I think there's a lot of different perspectives that one would have on grain elevators, and it depends who you ask. Lots of the people that I interviewed for my thesis work will have personal relationships with the elevators, whether it be most of the people that I interviewed are now adults, and so they would have had that experience of driving with their parents to the grain elevator to trade grain in a truck. So that's part of the evolution of the agricultural industry in Saskatchewan. So those people have a personal relationship with the elevators, as they house those memories of their childhood and what they felt when their parents went to trade grain. For other people, though, they sort of symbolize this old-fashioned or outdated technology that's now been replaced by the concrete elevators, which are faster they move grain faster, they store more, they're just much more economical for grain producers to move their grain. So there's a few different perspectives out there on grain elevators, but I think ultimately it's undeniable that they are part of the cultural landscape of Saskatchewan and really a symbol of the evolution of the agricultural industry. It's sad to see the wooden ones being constantly demolished, but I think part of that story is knowing where we've come from and understanding their value in today's world, and hopefully saving as many as we can in the future, so the next generation can also understand that important heritage.
Awesome, thanks, Ali. So can you share with us what drew you personally to wanting to study elevators for your master's work?
So like I mentioned, I'm from Saskatchewan originally, and my dad is a geographer, so we traveled a lot growing up, and I was always amazed at what kind of places defined each place we went to, like what architecture or what kind of people or what environment or landscape defined where we were. And I think that kind of carried through my entire architectural education. And then when it got to choosing a thesis topic, I wanted to do something that brought me home or back to Saskatchewan. And the topic of grain elevators was also I guess connected to something else I'm interested, which is an industrial heritage, or buildings that really were functional first and aesthetic second, or form follows function in its purest sense of the concept. And so ultimately the grain elevator was the perfect icon of both of those concepts of why some place exists the way that it does, and then this industrial heritage that's unique to Saskatchewan.
Right. It's such an interesting mix right there of exactly that industrial, but also we think of them often now sort of sitting lonely in an abandoned landscape, but at one time they were a very industrialized kind of piece of architecture. So that in itself is just fascinating,
Yes.
as well as your own personal memories of as a child growing up and traveling around with your dad. And so, Ali, during the course of your research on elevators, was there something that really kind of surprised you that you just hadn't thought of before you started doing your research?
I guess the biggest thing that came out of my research that I wasn't expecting was the diversity of perspective that people bring to the elevators. So I initially set out with my thesis question trying to understand why they're important. But what really came out was interviewing the elevator operators. It was their place of work. They just saw it as where they go every day. It wasn't important to them. But then I interviewed a newcomer to Canada, and they said when they moved to Saskatchewan, the first thing they wanted to do was go see a grain elevator, and that's iconic. So that's a different perspective. And then if you interview, like I mentioned earlier, some child that grew up with those memories, that's a different perspective. But then you also think of like an Indigenous perspective where, it was a sign of oppression, and that's a negative application of what these grain elevators mean. And so it really showed me that there's such a variation of meaning behind it, and where value lies is far broader than just saying they're important, because why they're important is really, that's what comes to fruition when you think of heritage or any sort of historic building. It's the varying perspectives that layer the meaning to really understand what it is and who it's important to, who and why.
Right. Those are such great perspectives. And that's where the living heritage element comes in, right? The elevator in itself exists, but the meanings we ascribe to it is the living heritage of those buildings. And you raise such good points about the differing perspectives, even me growing up on a farm and going to the elevator with my dad. And I have those very special memories that are really meaningful to my family and my background. But you're right that for other different people, it has a completely different meaning. And for Indigenous people, it is a symbol of colonialism, really. But also, I learned recently that a lot of the grain elevators in Saskatchewan, the wooden ones, were built using Indigenous and Métis labor, people from that were looking for work in the early, part of the 20th century. For some Métis and Indigenous people who, weren't accepted into sort of mainstream society, that was the kind of work that was available. And so a lot of these prairie icons were actually built by, Métis and Indigenous people, by their hands and their hard work. So that's another part of that story that sometimes I think gets a little bit lost in just seeing these pictures of an elevator and like a calendar, and that's like what Saskatchewan visually represents, right? But like there's so much more to it, that living heritage that's embedded within it, which is so great.
Yeah.
So I have a couple more questions for you. The first is, if anything were possible, how would you like to see grain elevators reimagined for our current contemporary society in the 21st century?
So I think, I really think that it needs to be a grassroots approach to each elevator on an individual basis. I think because they're so rooted in each place, that the community really needs to drive whatever project comes. So I was inspired to hear about the work in Val Marie, because that's an amazing example of a grassroots project where the community just wanted to save their elevator and they did everything they could. And it's exciting to see what's coming out of it, and the work that you're doing down there. So to look at like that as, the golden child example of what a community can do when they want to. Gravelberg is another example where the community bound together and bought their elevator and saved it. They did a rehabilitation of the ground floor area, so they have an accessible ramp now. You can like take a wheelchair into it and go and explore what that inner space looks like. There's a few different examples of communities that have successfully taken ownership of their elevators and done some creative projects on them. But I think I would like to see it push beyond that. I would like to see it as a place that is so connected to the community that if it were to be lost, then the community would feel that sense of loss for anything. So I'm picturing like a coffee shop. And I know we think about, I mean, from my research, I witnessed all of these seniors and farmers that always get together every morning and have their coffee. And I'm just picturing that happening in a grain elevator, and that environment that's so prairie and the quintessential place to have this gathering of people and bringing these memories together, for me, is in a grain elevator. So I would like to see a program that's less about a museum and more about an active, everyday, useful, vibrant place for the community. So if that were possible in every community, I think we would see this network of grain elevators as these hubs in the community that would really create these, I think, quite magical prairie communities. So that would be my dream.
Yeah, well, I mean, when you speak about it, and I'll put a link to your thesis in the comments below, or the description box below, so people can check that out, so they can see your beautiful renderings of what that could actually look like. And it's so inspiring to hear you speak about that. And absolutely, you're talking about taking these buildings and turning them once again into living buildings that, you know, live in the community and grow and move along with the community through time, and aren't just sort of fossilized remnants of a past time, right?
Exactly.
So on that note, just to finish off today, like, what inspired this Globe and Mail article was, you know, the loss of elevators. And there's an individual from the community of Lapine, Saskatchewan, who reached out on social media, and she reached out to us at Heritage Saskatchewan, I think also to the National Trust, asking like, what can be done? And it is a tall order, but you know, if you could give just a piece of advice to individuals and communities who are passionate about wanting to preserve grain elevators, or even any other kind of architecture in their community, what would you say that they should do first? What's the first thing that they can do to try and create that grassroots movement that you're talking about?
I would say trying to capture all of those stories and those memories and why this building is important for that community would be the first step. So whether that be some photographs or a written piece or some sort of community meeting, basically just capture the importance of that elevator first and foremost, because what happens when you do that is it gives you it positions you to create a project and some sort of initiative that would take the elevator from an abandoned place, or perhaps it's still owned by a grain company who just doesn't want it anymore. It takes it into the community's hands, and it gives them the opportunity to do something really exciting with it. And so by understanding its importance, that's the first level of any project. And then from there, you can decide what you want to do with it. But ultimately, understanding its importance first is critical. And I think the Lapine example is challenging because, as I'm sure we've seen in the photos, it's not rooted in a specific town per se, whereas many other elevators are still in towns. I know Wolseley still has an elevator, and the town is vibrant. They have a lot of heritage projects going on there. So that's an example where the community it's right there. It's in everybody's backyard, this elevator. But Lapine is challenging. So for examples like that, I would again challenge people to think outside the box. If it's possible to move an elevator, 50 years ago, they did it. If an elevator burned down in one community, they picked one up from town down over and moved it over. It's still possible today. These structures are so strong. So let's move it to somewhere where it will be accepted and appreciated for that amazing heritage that it has.
Absolutely. There's actually a great National Film Board film called The Move, which shows that happening. I'll put a link to that. I'm going to have a lot of links for all of you watching this. to link to our Val Marie project, which does exactly what Ali talks about, which is takes this building and actually delves into why is it significant and important for the community. And I'll link to Ali's thesis and also to the little NFB short, because it does show that these things can be done, and we don't just have to accept that the buildings we care about in our communities, that they're too far gone or that there's nothing can be done. We can't save all of them, but I think we can definitely save some, and communities like Val Marie have shown that that's possible, and work like Ali has shown just how exciting the possibilities are for these buildings that are really a beloved symbol for a lot of people of prairie agriculture and rural life in Saskatchewan. So Ali, thank you so much for being with us today. It was always great. It's always great to chat with you, and I love hearing your passion come through about these buildings, and I look forward to chatting with you again at some point. So
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks.